Alina Sukhanova, and the topic of my today's talk is to trust is a good thing, but trusting too much is probably dangerous. Let me introduce myself. For the last year, I've been working in the global emergency response team at Kaspersky. Before that, I worked in computer criminal studies of Bizone. My main focus is incidents in cybersecurity, investigations, and reverse of malware. I've been in this business for about 6 years. In my talk today, I wanted to discuss what attacks are via trusted relationships and what is their place in the landscape of modern attacks, and also to share with you some cases where we had to investigate this kind of attacks. And after that, I will formulate some recommendations that will, if not help you avoid those attacks, but at least to minimize the risks and implications. Let's get started. This kind of attacks are growing around the world. Outsourcing is growing too. This is a diagram from Statista.com. It's true. And when the companies engage contractors or outsourcing entities, these customers will have to provide the outsourcers with access to their own infrastructure. And yes, sometimes the outsourcers come with their own laptops, but what happens most often is that the customers set up workstations to those people. They provide access to their internal infrastructure to the outsourced employees. And there are different ways in which access can be gained to the internal infrastructure. For instance, VPN, using certificates or login password, or multi-factor identification can be used, and sometimes access gained without it. No one also prevents you from using utilities for distant control, like AnyDesk or AnyAdmin, or you can set up a password-based access. If you know the identifier and the password, you will be able to connect to the infrastructure bypassing the VPNs. Or you can also use SHRDP with a wide IP address. The last two items on the list are prone with risks, but in this trusted attack, third-party access via VPN is also prone with risks. So the question arises, security, how to ensure security. The organizations do not always think about the security of access provided to third parties. For instance, the time limit is never set. In our experience, there were cases when the contractor was done with their job, say 6 months ago, but the credentials that were issued to this contractor were still valid. And by cracking the contractor, the attackers found the creds, and they were able to connect to the infrastructure of the target victim. The third-party organizations that provide contractors with access to the infrastructure cannot control for compliance with the security policies about this access. You will never know whether the contractor keeps a text file on the work desk somewhere next to the creds or not. All of this leads to the situation when the risk of trusted attacks increases. Starting from 2023, we observe a significant increase in the number of such attacks. They are quite beneficial for the attacker. This vector allows the attacker to launch a large-scale attack with minimal resources. An attacker hacks a contractor, gets credentials to the clients of this contractor, and hence many victims. Otherwise, the attacker will have to attack each of these third parties individually, and probably the attacker wouldn't succeed every time. These attacks are also prone with risks for the business and for the organizations because they are difficult to detect. They start usually with legitimate connections with IP addresses, VPN or IP addresses of the contractor, and the legitimate credentials that were issued to this contractor in the past are used. Another disadvantage of this attack and the benefit for the attacker is that an attacker hacks the supplier. The supplier had many customers. We did an investigation, we found the intrusion vector, and say we got lucky, and we also investigated the supplier, and the supplier knows that the supplier is compromised. Most likely, suppliers will be afraid of reputational risks in those scenarios, and -1 of their customers could be also infected with these attacks, but they would never find out about it. Supply chain attacks or trusted attacks are a trend of 2023. We collected statistics in the analytical report of the attacks that we investigated at Kaspersky Labs in 2023, and these are the numbers that we achieved. 50% of supply chain attacks were identified only after the data leak was detected, when the attackers not only attacked the company, but when they filtered the data and published the outputs in the Telegram channels. For 25% of the victims, the consequences were very dire. The data was encrypted, and only every fourth customer could, or third party could detect an attack with their own means. Now let's turn to a case study. It's not an isolated case. It was a series of attacks, so there were several episodes of this kind. This is autumn 2023. Infrastructure of a major organization was encrypted. To encrypt, the attackers used Lockbit 3.0. Its builder is already online. Everybody uses it if they are not lazy. Lockbit encrypts nicely, and without the private key of the attacker, we can't help. But what's important is to investigate the case and identify the compromise vector. In every incident, an investigation is due, because after decryption, yes, infrastructure can be restored, resources can be spent on that, but if you couldn't find the location where the actual penetration happened, then the attackers might come back. They will have to restore. You will have to restore your infrastructure one more time. Just like in all cases related to encryption attacks, we started with triaging of several encrypted systems. Triages are data sets like system logs and file registers that could still have traces of the attacker's presence in the systems. Our primary analysis demonstrated that yes, the systems were encrypted. We were not deceived. System and security and several other logs were cleansed by the attackers. They took good care of us so that we wouldn't have to do this job. But the other half of the system, these logs either didn't have enough depth, about 1.5 hours. Even if we were to respond quickly, still we wouldn't be able to capture the actual moment of intrusion. Or for some reason, logging was not enabled for important events like 4624 successful logs in security VTX. So this looks sad, but an artifact of PSExec helped us. PSExec is a utility of remote and the execution of commands, and attackers love it because it's so easy. This utility, starting from 2.30, its release took place in 2021. In the USN log leaves the following artifact. USN log is the Windows log that contains all information of file activity, which files were created, changed, or deleted in the system for a certain period of time. PSExec in the USN log, well, it records the creation and deletion of that key files. It gives us an idea that PSExec was definitely launched, and the names of these files contains a line of containing information about the host from which PSExec was launched. And in this case, it was the domain controller name, and then we started investigating this domain controller. The domain controller didn't show any results. We confirmed that, yes, abusers use this domain controller to deploy the attack. They also use this controller to connect to the infrastructure using RDP protocol and to collect a lot of data to share them later. What's curious is in which RTP session all of this happened. The attacker connected to the domain controller from some test server that was provided to the supplier, to the contractor, as you will have already guessed. So we started analyzing this test server. It was one of the few systems. The abusers used all of the systems actually that were provided to the supplier. The logs were cleansed, but the abuser did not cleanse the RTP connections log. And this is where we found the most curious artifact. Around the incident, over a period of several days, there was a legal connection via a VPN sub-network, and then the source IP showed the result that's shown on the slide, colon, percentage sign, 1677, etc. If you know, then you know. If not, then if you see this value in source IP, this is an artifact of connected to the system using a tunneling utility. If in the infrastructure no tunneling utilities are used in general, and probably the admins would have known about this, then this artifact is a bad sign. We found this utility quickly. We found the utility ngrog. It mimicked to ECC host process. This one is a dual-use utility. Actually, you can download it from the official website, but attackers love it, again, because it's so easy to use. This utility starts by sending a config file .yml. The attacker identifies the identification token there and the forwards that need to be forwarded outside. In those series, they were forwarding the 339 port. And this allowed them to connect to the compromised system outside using the RTP protocol without VPN 339. In this case, this port has become available to them from the outside. In addition to ngrog, the system also had all other stuff like Cobblstrike beacon and chisel. It felt like the attacker started with brute forcing different utilities and decided that ngrog was the easiest to use. In addition to these utilities, the system also contained different add peas or blood counts to investigate the domains, mimicards to dump passwords, etc. All of this told us that this test server proved to be the penetration point for the intruder into the system. Another interesting fact, in one of the cases, the incident with encryption happened in one day, and the ngrog files, the executable files, and the config files were created several days ahead. And what caught our eye is that LNK files that refer to directory and config of ngrog were created on a completely different date, 2.5 months before the date of the main incident. Immediately we checked the RTP entry logs, and they showed us that the attacker compromised the infrastructure 2.5 months before the actual incident. And this activity was next to impossible to detect, because this is how it looked like. The attacker connected to VPN, then entered the RTP, then uploaded ngrog, fixed it, disconnected from this session, from this RTP session, then connected via ngrog, checked that everything worked, disconnected, and disappeared, and never came back for 2.5 months. What we did next is, since our activity came from the VPN connection, we had to check the VPN logs. And as expected, well, we expected that at that time, all connections to VPN during suspicious activity on the systems turned out to be happening from an account that was provided to the contractor. The attacker used one account to connect to VPN, and then infrastructure, the attacker used several accounts, and all of these accounts were used by the contractor while they acted as a contractor for that particular company. And here we got lucky because the supply allowed us to investigate their infrastructure. It was a small company. For you to understand how small it is, it's about 20 hosts in the infrastructure. Since the hosts were few in numbers, we checked the connections, we identified the systems that were used to enable RTP connections to the test server of our client. And this customer, when they were compromised, IP addresses of the Proton VP and the public anonymization server were used on the connections at the supplier. We also found out that a tunneling utility ngrok was also mimicking SV host, but it also used Proton VPN. We checked the public scanning servers and we found out that the machine on which all this activity happened during this incident was available from the outside. Then probably it was disconnected from the outer world, but the attacker continued to connect to it via their own ngrok. So the question is, where did the attacker found the credentials to connect to the infrastructure of the customer? We ran the analysis, and on the supplier side, we found the LNK file that referred to the certificate file to connect to the VPN of our client. And this certificate was stored on a shared disk with a directory that had a name that basically said that this is the certificate to connect to a VPN of such and such organization. It was issued to such and such user. So this shared folder was stored on the FTP server that was available from the outside via port 21. Unfortunately, at the time of investigation, we could not investigate what happened on the spot on this FTP server because it was no longer available for our analysis. So the primary results were as follows. The infrastructure was indeed compromised because on some systems, on a big number of systems, the ngrok tunneling utility that mimicked SVC host was installed. And during investigation, we had to go back a long time, and it was very difficult to understand from which system to which other system the attacker went in order to upload the ngrok and everything. But we identified the timeline. We found the first infected machine. We found the logs. And we know that the attacker accessed it via RDP from a Linux machine. So basically, no, you can't think. Well, actually, no admin probably would be using RDP on a Linux system to get from a Linux system to a Windows system, especially a Linux system that runs a website on a CMS Bittrex. So we found the vector of intrusion. Bittrex turned out to be compromised. We found many web shells on Bittrex. So that was the compromised vector. And another curious fact emerged every time when the Bittrex server in the contractor's network started behaving suspiciously. It was just played back to the previous version. The backed up version. No one tried to run an antivirus scan. No one tried to investigate the integrity of the files. They just went to an earlier backed up version. 1.5 months later, because other victims also contacted us, Let me tell you about one other victim. This victim identified suspicious activity in the infrastructure access via RTP protocol using credentials of a disconnected, disabled account. When we investigated the triages, the name of the systems that we saw there looked suspiciously just like the name of the system that was first compromised at our first victim, the first customer. And then we started thinking, is this a coincidence? And then we did further analysis. We realized that no, it's not a coincidence. The infrastructure of the new victim was compromised on the same day as the first victim's infrastructure, is 1 hour apart. It was the same procedure and grok in the SVC host.exe. You will have already guessed that our new victim used the services of the same supplier. Here we had a success story. The techniques and the tactics were already known to us. We know that they use SVC host, and we helped the victim fast, and we helped them avoid encryption of their infrastructure. Conclusions. These are the lessons learned from this incident. The attacker compromised a very small contractor. The compromise vector was quite straightforward. Vulnerability in Bittrex. The attacker somewhere on the shared disk found lots of credentials to connect to the clients of that contractor. And in just one day, they compromised all of these customers using ngrok. And then, in 2.5 to 3 months, when the attacker had time, they came back to these victims in order to exfiltrate the data and to preferably paralyze the operations of the new victim by launching the encryptor. Time went by and new cases were coming up. This is a different attacker group with different techniques, but they also use supply chain attack, or trusted relationship attack, as we call it. This is winter 2024. A customer came to us. They found suspicious activity on their infrastructure. This suspicious activity was that there were some illegitimate access using RTP between servers that shouldn't be there. The customer blocked the accounts that were used in this registered activity, and they asked us, is this really suspicious? So we started analyzing this case. Very quickly, on one of the machines, we found RTP accesses, IP addresses that belong to a VPN service. The blocking of access for the attacker was quite unexpected, and they didn't have time to remove their traces. So in the directory, we found all their tools. The tools were nothing special, various utilities for scanning, remote execution of commands, even an exploit for Eternal Blue. Attackers still use it. Would you believe it? There was a utility for remote control, like any desk, ngrok, tunneling, so all pretty standard. Of the curious stuff, if in the previous series of cases ngrok was a regular ngrok downloaded from the official website, here the attackers decided to customize it. They made it look like Microsoft Office. It was ngrok, but with a different name and a different icon. And later, in these attackers' attacks, we also found other names, OneDrive, VMware tools. They also changed the icons. And what's curious about these cases is that sometimes the abusers would launch ngrok manually. When a port had to be forwarded to themselves, they would add the authentication token manually, and they would launch the ngrok. They also used click to run, they used service, but those cases were fewer. What was important to do is to check the VPN connection, because we found suspicious connections via RTP using VPN IP addresses. And here we saw that the first connection during the legitimate activity period were initiated from the addresses of the contractor of this victim. After that, the attacker established connections using Proton VPN. The logs were solid, and the logs gave us the names of the system from the contractor's infrastructure, where we had to continue our search. And we got lucky one more time. We carried out a full-fledged investigation at the contractor's site. As always, the supplier turned out to be a small company. We checked the system with a name from the VPN logs of our customer. And in the system logs, in the PowerShell logs, we found the traces of PowerShell backdoor. Earlier, I forgot to mention that this directory with the tools of the attackers that we found on the compromised machine, they also included the PowerShell backdoor. It's just that in the infrastructure of that customer didn't have time to use that backdoor, so it was just there. We stopped the attacker sooner, but here we saw the artifacts of this PowerShell backdoor. It was quite obvious, and we knew that the attacker used it. While it was active, we saw accesses from a Linux machine that ran VMware vCenter. Not to miss anything, we checked several other Windows-based systems, and there we also found artifacts of PowerShell backdoor operation, and also entries of the abuser from the same VMware vCenter server. As a next step, we needed to check this server running VMware vCenter. When the customer's incident occurred on that day, the system acquired the new file with the fscan utility. fscan utility, special utility to check the running of various systems. And we also found executable files of fscan in the update directory and the RSOX utility. As you can tell from the slides, the executable utility slides were placed there 3 months before the actual incident. On the same date, when RSOX utilities and fscan utility were installed, also the FaceFish backdoor was installed on the system. A FaceFish is a backdoor that can execute the code that it gets from the command and control server. What's interesting is that at the same time there were no suspicious entry via SSH, and the server was not available from the outside. So the question is, how could the attacker place the FaceFish backdoor on this machine? Here, around the FaceFish emergence on the server, we found the GSP files, quite suspicious. When it comes to analyzing web servers, GSP files that look suspicious often turn out to be web shells. And this is what happened in this case. Around the incident, we found, around the incident time, we found web shells.
Understanding how those web shells ended up in the system, we were able, with the help of Google, a few web shells were in the web apps root directory, and we saw the exploitation code that puts something in the root directory. The name consists of 6 symbols with the extension JSP, and the name is generated from lowercase letters and numbers. Pretty much what we see in our case. We also found the file called shell.gsp And again, we were able to understand how it found its way to the system. On GitHub, we found a code to exploit another vulnerability. And this exploit helped load the shell GSP file, whose code was identical to the one that we found in the system. But the server is not available from the outside. And a complication was that 4 months passed and almost all logs in the system were filled. The only option was to search for HTTP requests in all VMware logs, looking for JSP scripts. And again, we were lucky. We only found 2 requests to the shell JSP file, even though they had a 404 code in response, but still that were at the needed time. And so we found out that the exploitation of the vulnerability was not from inside the system. The hacker tried to use the GitHub code. This is the internal address from which VMware vCenter was exploited, kept in Confluence. And as we established, the credentials to connect were stored in an open form on one of the pages in Confluence. At the time of the incident, at the time of the breach, the Confluence were available from outside, from the internet. And making a step further, according to the web archive, the Confluence was of a vulnerable version, which helped execute a code on the server. Conclusions. A hacker compromised a contractor, a small one, with a very trivial approach, RC in Confluence. The adversary obtained the credentials of clients of its victim that were stored in Confluence. And in 3 months' time, the adversary got back in 3 months' time, following up on their attacks. Now I would like to formulate the recommendations for contractors and for companies that give access to their network. These recommendations mostly relate to attacks to trusted relationships. These are recommendations for the target organizations that allow others to work in their network. When you do that, you've got to provide access on a temporary basis, and previously I mentioned why. The contractors may not be working on a project 6 months already, and their access is still valid. It's important to monitor VPN connections, what IP address, what account, what date for the VPN connection. And this could help identify some non-legitimate connection and also to effectively investigate the incident if the incident was to happen. It's important to use a reliable password policy. That's a general recommendation, but passwords like QWERTY 123 are still being used and abused by adversaries. Had the customers used multi-factor authentication when connecting to the VPN, those incidents could have been avoided altogether. It is important to use a minimum privilege principle. You only give accounts to contractors without any privileges in the domain. And it's important to segment the network so that the systems that are provided to third parties did not have network connectivity. And they couldn't be used as backdoors to get into more sensitive systems. It is important to have identical requirements in information security for third parties. If your infrastructure uses monitoring and it's mandatory, then for them, the monitoring should also be configured. If you store any logs for 6 months and longer, and that's what you should do, then in the system to which you get access to your internal infrastructure should also have the same. One of the incidents demonstrated the importance of monitoring the chain of accounts used. If a connection happens using an account of one user, and further connections happen with an account of another user, such events have to be considered as incidents and treated separately. It's important to monitor remote access utilities and tunneling utilities, I mean legitimate ones, especially when there is no case for using them in a particular situation. When a tunneling utility was never used and suddenly the system starts addressing ngrok domains, that certainly deserves attention. It is possible to detect the activity of an adversary when they are already on the network and start to make some actions. It's important to detect port scanning or brute forcing of passwords for local and domain accounts. Special attention should be paid to out-of-working hours activity. If a user has never worked at night and suddenly there's a VPN connection using their credentials, that's not a good thing. And when the worst comes to the worst, when the infrastructure gets encrypted, it's important to do regular backups and to protect, make sure that your backups are secured. This slide gives some recommendations that you could share with your contractors. If contractors get access to the infrastructure of other organizations, it is necessary to properly maintain these credentials, not in Confluence, not in shared files, not in text files on your desktop. It would also be good to log connections by contractors to third parties. In case of an incident, that could really help. Practice shows that in small contractor organizations, incidents might happen because of a software that wasn't updated on time. That is why it is important to update your software and to use security tools, to observe the password policy, not to use weak passwords. And also, it's important to monitor legitimate tools of remote connection and tunneling utilities. That brings me to the end of my presentation. If you are interested in what we do, our team is always actively looking for new members. Thank you for your attention. Oh yes, questions. If you have any questions, you're welcome.
We are under attack. Incoming missiles. Evasive action.
Так, ну вот вижу вопрос.
Okay, we have a question. How long did the investigation take? You said that a connection from Proton VPN is not a good thing. Do you have any statistics on the suspicious VPN solutions? Well, in terms of the time of the investigation, if you mean from the time the company detected an activity or from the first compromised RDP logons, it took us very little, probably up to 2 days. I guess even less than that. Talking about the further review of the infrastructure of what the adversaries could have done or have done, here we spent some more time. We were more attentive in looking at that. And did a longer analysis, took some 1 or 2 weeks to analyze the infrastructure. In terms of the top least secure VPNs, I don't have the statistics, but top VPN is perhaps the most popular that adversaries use. Supply chain attacks are often confused with trusted relationship attacks. What is the difference between them? Trusted relationship attacks is when adversaries use the existing trusted relationship between organizations. Well, you can start with these types of attacks being different. MITRE has different identifiers for them. Trusted relationship attack is when companies have a trusted relationship and you can connect to the infrastructure. And supply chain, as far as I know, that's when software is modified. And later that hacker-modified software is distributed. I hope I answered this question. The question was off the microphone. The answer is yes, that as well.
Да. Ну, на случай эксфильтрации, да, согласна.
Yes, for exfiltering, I would agree.
Это да.
Yes.
Выпустить жирный улов с этой организации, возникнет ситуация ОПС, которая будет требовать разрешения.
You might come across a situation that would have to be resolved, that you cannot
Инцидент, требующий немедленного реагирования.
resolve quickly, and that would be an incident that calls for an immediate response.
Можно, конечно,
To
развернуть супер-пупер умную систему.
catch an adversary, you can deploy a very smart system, but a couple of crutches and rakes, so to say, hidden in dark places, would negate the effort, and they're also cheaper, by the way.
Спасибо за доклад.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a couple of questions. First, are there any best practices that you can download and use in terms of logging with the contractor? So what can I turn on to make life easier for investigator? And my second question, what's your attitude to event forwarding to make sure they are not wiped out in a system? Well, I'm not prepared to answer the first question now. We can discuss later. Second, yes, event forwarding is a good practice. For one, you can store them for the necessary amount of time. That's A. And B, they won't be deleted by the adversary.
Все? Так.
Are we done?
Вопрос.
Встречались ли случаи, когда...
Next question. Have you come across hackers breaking the system
Не услышала начала.
Бывали ли случаи,
Have you come
когда
across
хакеры
a
взламывали
situation when hackers breach the system and talk to the company, showing where the breach happens, but looking for ransom? Answer: in the trusted relationship incidents that we came across, we didn't ever see this happen.
Скажите,
Да,
пожалуйста,
так.
у меня вот вопрос.
Ну, у меня еще два вот этих вот. У меня три, в общем, вопроса нужно выбрать.
Okay, I have 3 questions to choose from. Can I still ask a question?
Можно?
Да.
Can I still ask a question? Yes.
Я хотел поинтересоваться, а вот насколько реально такая ситуация, что
How real is the situation
с помощью вот, вектора, который вы
when
рассматриваете, могут замаскировать реальный вектор атаки?
using the vector that you described, the real vector attack could be disguised?
Что в одном месте злоумышленник трет логи,
It's strange to see that in one place an adversary deletes logs and doesn't in others. And is it possible that you found one attack vector, but in reality it was different? Have you come across that? A decoy? No, I never came across that. I never saw